I never thought my mailbox would become a federal crime scene. But here we are in the middle of January 2026, with postal inspectors crawling all over my property in Duluth, Minnesota, and my HOA president sitting in the back of a police car. It all started last November when the first real cold snap hit northern Minnesota. I'm Scott Jenkins, a software developer who works from home, and I'd been living in the Lakeview Meadows subdivision for about 3 years. The place seemed nice enough when I bought my house, a modest ranch-style home with a decent yard and a view of nothing particularly special despite what the subdivision name suggested. The HOA fees were reasonable, and I figured I could handle the occasional busybody complaint about lawn height or Christmas decorations staying up too long. What I didn't count on was Patricia Reinhardt. Patricia was the HOA president, a woman in her mid-50s with that particular haircut that seemed to be standard issue for her type. You know the one. Short, aggressively styled, usually blonde with highlights. She wore velour tracksuits in various pastel colors and drove a white BMW SUV with a live, laugh, love sticker on the back window. She had moved into the neighborhood about 6 months before I did, and had immediately inserted herself into every possible position of authority she could find. The mailbox situation began on November 18th. I remember the date clearly because it was the day after my birthday, and I was still eating leftover cake for breakfast when Patricia knocked on my door at 7:30 in the morning. The temperature had dropped to negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and I was standing there in my bathrobe, cake fork in hand, staring at her through the screen door. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her breath coming out in white puffs, "we need to discuss your mailbox." I blinked at her, still not fully caffeinated. "My mailbox?" "Yes. I drove past at 6 this morning and there was steam coming from it." "Steam, Mr. Jenkins." That's a clear violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws regarding unauthorized modifications to community-facing structures. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what she was saying. "You're telling me you have a problem with my mailbox being warm?" "It's not about being warm," she said, pulling out a printed copy of the HOA bylaws from her oversized purse. "It's about unauthorized modifications. Did you install a heating element in your mailbox?" "Yeah, I did," I said. "Last week." The mail carrier mentioned that my mailbox lock had frozen shut twice, and she'd had to skip my delivery. I looked it up online, and apparently mailbox heaters are pretty common in Minnesota. Cost me $40 at the hardware store. Patricia's face turned an interesting shade of pink. "That's completely irrelevant. You made a modification to a community-facing structure without submitting Form HOA 7B for approval. That's a violation, and I'm going to have to issue you a fine." "A fine? For making sure I can receive my mail?" "The fine is $200 for the first offense, and you'll need to remove the heating element immediately. If you fail to comply within 48 hours, the fine increases to $500 and will pursue legal action." I felt my blood pressure rising despite the freezing temperature. "Patricia, it's a mailbox heater. It uses less electricity than a nightlight. It's literally just keeping the mailbox warm enough so the lock doesn't freeze shut. Rules are rules, Mr. Jenkins. The HOA exists to maintain property values and community standards. If we let everyone modify their mailboxes however they want, where does it end? Before you know it, people will be painting them ridiculous colors or mounting decorations on them. It's inside the mailbox. Nobody can even see it." I could see the steam this morning. Because it was negative 15 degrees outside, everything that's warm creates steam in that temperature. Patricia pursed her lips. Your hostility is noted, Mr. Jenkins. You have 48 hours. Good day. She turned and marched back to her BMW, leaving me standing there in my bathrobe, holding a fork with a piece of birthday cake still on it, wondering if I just hallucinated the entire conversation. I wish I had. 2 days later, I received an official HOA violation notice in my mailbox. The irony wasn't lost on me. The notice was printed on official letterhead, complete with the Lakeview Meadows logo, a clip art image of a lake and some trees that bore no resemblance to our actual neighborhood. It detailed my violation, the associated fine, and the steps I needed to take to come into compliance. I didn't remove the heater. Instead, I did what any reasonable person would do in 2026. I started researching. I spent hours reading through the actual HOA bylaws, all 67 pages of them. Section 12. Paragraph 4 did indeed mention modifications to community-facing structures, but it specifically listed examples like paint colors, decorative elements, and structural changes. There was nothing about internal modifications that weren't visible from the street. I also researched Minnesota state law regarding mail delivery and homeowner rights. What I found was interesting. According to federal regulations, homeowners are required to maintain their mailboxes in a condition that allows for safe and reliable mail delivery. If a mailbox is repeatedly inaccessible due to frozen locks, the Postal Service has the right to suspend delivery to that address. Armed with this information, I drafted a response to the HOA. I kept it professional and cited specific bylaw language and federal regulations. I explained that the heater was necessary to comply with federal mail delivery requirements, and that it didn't violate the spirit or letter of the HOA bylaws as written. I requested that the fine be withdrawn, and that the HOA update its bylaws to explicitly address necessary functional modifications. I should have known Patricia wouldn't take it well. 3 days after I submitted my response, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. The letter informed me that my fine had been increased to $500 due to my continued non-compliance, and that if I didn't remove the mailbox heater within 7 days, the HOA would pursue legal action to place a lien on my property. A lien on my property. Over a $40 mailbox heater. I called an attorney myself, a guy named Derek Martinez who specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Duluth, in one of those old converted warehouses overlooking Lake Superior. When I explained the situation, he actually laughed. "Let me get this straight," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They're threatening to lien your property because you installed a heating element to keep your mailbox functional in Minnesota winter. That's exactly what's happening. And this heating element, it's not visible from the outside. Only when it's cold enough that you can see heat vapor, which happens with anything that's warmer than the ambient temperature." Derek shook his head. "This is absurd, even for an HOA case. Look, technically they have the right to enforce their bylaws, but any judge is going to look at this and see it for what it is: petty tyranny. The problem is, fighting them could cost you more in legal fees than just paying the fine and removing the heater. But then my mail carrier can't deliver my mail when the mailbox freezes shut." Exactly. Which is why this is so stupid. You're caught between federal mail regulations and an overreaching HOA. My advice: document everything. Take photos of your mailbox heater. Get a statement from your mail carrier about the frozen lock issue, and keep records of any mail delivery problems. If they do try to lien your property, we'll fight it, and we'll probably win. But it's going to be a headache. I left his office feeling frustrated but slightly more confident. I took his advice and documented everything. I photographed the mailbox heater from every angle. I talked to my mail carrier, a woman named Linda who'd been delivering mail in the area for 15 years. She was more than happy to provide a written statement about the frozen mailbox issue, and even mentioned that several other houses in the neighborhood had similar problems. "Honestly," Linda said, standing by her mail truck, her breath fogging in the cold December air, "I don't understand why anyone would complain about a mailbox heater. Makes my job easier and it's not hurting anyone. I've seen way worse." Guy on the next route over has a mailbox shaped like a giant fish. "That thing's a hazard. Nearly took my mirror off once." I thanked her and added her statement to my growing file of documentation. Then I waited. December rolled on and the temperature continued to drop. Minnesota winters are no joke, and that year was shaping up to be particularly brutal. By mid-December, we were seeing regular temperatures in the -20s, and the forecast was predicting even colder weather after Christmas. Patricia didn't let up. I received weekly violation notices, each one threatening increasingly severe consequences. The fine had ballooned to $1,000, and the HOA attorney's letters became more aggressive in tone. According to their latest communication, if I didn't comply by December 31st, they would begin lien proceedings in January. I consulted with Derek again, and he assured me that their threats were mostly bluster. "They can try to lien your property, but they'll have to justify it in court, and no judge is going to side with them on this. Keep the heater running, keep documenting everything, and let them make the next move." So that's what I did. Christmas came and went. I kept my mailbox heater running, received my mail without any issues, and ignored Patricia's increasingly shrill violation notices. Then, on December 30th, something changed. I went out to check my mail that afternoon and found my mailbox door hanging open. The small LED light from my mailbox heater was off. I peered inside and saw that the heater had been unplugged. The cord, which ran along the inside of the mailbox post and connected to an outdoor outlet on my porch, had been cut, not unplugged. Cut. Someone had taken a pair of wire cutters or scissors and deliberately severed the cord about halfway down the post. I stood there in the -20-degree weather, staring at the cut cord, feeling a hot surge of anger that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't just petty anymore. This was destruction of property. This was someone coming onto my property and deliberately sabotaging my mailbox. I immediately went inside and called the police. The officer who responded, a young guy named Officer Thompson, took a report and photographs. He agreed that it appeared to be intentional vandalism, but he was honest about the likelihood of finding the culprit. "Unless you have security camera footage, it's going to be tough to prove who did this," he said, standing on my front porch with his notebook. "Do you have any cameras?" "No," I admitted. "Never thought I'd need them in a quiet subdivision. You'd be surprised. HOA disputes get nasty sometimes. People do weird stuff. My advice, get a camera, point it at your mailbox. If this person comes back, you'll have evidence." I thanked him and went back inside, my mind racing. I was 90% sure Patricia was behind this, but I couldn't prove it. She was petty enough to do it, and she'd certainly made her feelings about my mailbox heater clear. But would she really go onto my property and commit vandalism? The next day was New Year's Eve, and I spent the morning at the hardware store. I bought a new mailbox heater, extra cord, and a weatherproof security camera with night vision. I spent the afternoon installing everything, running the new heater cord through PVC conduit this time so it couldn't easily be cut, and mounting the camera on my porch with a clear view of the mailbox. That night, the temperature dropped to -30 degrees. The wind chill made it feel even colder. I watched the weather report with a growing sense of unease. These were the kinds of temperatures where everything stopped working. Car batteries died. Water pipes froze. Exposed skin got frostbite in minutes, and mailboxes froze solid. The next morning, January 1st, I went out to check my mailbox. The heater was still working, thank God. The little LED light glowed reassuringly inside the mailbox, and when I opened the door, it swung easily. I didn't have any mail yet, of course. It was a federal holiday. But the mailbox was warm and functional. I noticed as I walked back to my house that several of my neighbors were having trouble with their mailboxes. The guy across the street, an older man named Bill, was standing at his mailbox with a hairdryer plugged into an extension cord, trying to thaw the lock. 2 houses down, a woman was pouring hot water on her mailbox door, trying to get it to open. Nobody else in the neighborhood had mailbox heaters. And over the next few days, it became very clear that they needed them. January 2nd was the first weekday after New Year's, which meant mail delivery should have resumed. I checked my mailbox around 2 in the afternoon, the usual time Linda came by, and found several pieces of mail inside. Bills, some junk mail, and a package notification slip. Everything normal. That evening, I saw Bill from across the street walking his dog. He stopped at the edge of my driveway and we chatted for a minute. "Noticed you're still getting your mail," he said, his voice slightly bitter. "Lucky you." "Your mailbox frozen, solid as a rock. Linda couldn't deliver to me or anyone else on this side of the street. Said she'd try again tomorrow if it warms up, but the forecast isn't looking good." He was right. The forecast was calling for continued extreme cold for at least another week, with temperatures staying below -10 even during the day. Over the next several days, I watched the situation deteriorate. Linda tried to deliver mail each day, but more and more mailboxes were frozen shut. By January 5th, she told me that out of 43 houses in Lakeview Meadows, she could only deliver to 7. Mine was one of them. The others, apparently, had also installed mailbox heaters despite the HOA rules. We were the rebels, the rule breakers, the ones who dared to prioritize functional mail delivery over Patricia's interpretation of community standards. Patricia, predictably, lost her mind. On January 6th, she called an emergency HOA meeting. The notice went out via email to all residents, marked as mandatory attendance. The meeting was scheduled for 7 that evening at the community center, a small building at the entrance to the subdivision that mostly sat empty except for HOA meetings and the occasional neighborhood garage sale. I almost didn't go. I was tired of Patricia's drama and I had work to catch up on. But Derek had advised me to attend all HOA meetings and document everything, so I bundled up and drove the 3 blocks to the community center. The room was packed. Apparently, not receiving mail for nearly a week had motivated people to show up. I recognized most of the faces neighbors I'd waved to but never really talked to, people I'd seen at the neighborhood 4th of July barbecue. Everyone looked cold and annoyed. Patricia stood at the front of the room behind a folding table, looking particularly stern in a purple velour tracksuit. Next to her sat 2 other board members, both middle-aged women who seemed to exist primarily to nod along with whatever Patricia said. "Thank you all for coming," Patricia began, her voice echoing slightly in the sparse room. "I've called this emergency meeting to address a critical issue affecting our community. As you're all aware, we're experiencing extremely cold weather, and this has caused some problems with mail delivery." "Some problems?" someone called out from the back. "I haven't gotten my mail in 6 days. I'm expecting medication." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Patricia held up her hand for silence. I understand your frustration. However, the solution is not to violate HOA bylaws by installing unauthorized modifications to your mailboxes. Several residents have taken it upon themselves to install heating elements without proper approval, and this cannot be tolerated. Why not? The question came from a woman I didn't recognize, standing near the front. My mailbox has been frozen solid for a week. The post office says they can't deliver if they can't open the box. What are we supposed to do? You submit Form HOA 7B requesting permission to modify your mailbox, Patricia said. Once the board reviews your request, we'll make a determination about whether the modification is acceptable. How long does that take? Someone else asked. The board meets once a month to review requests. The next meeting is scheduled for February 15th. The room erupted. People were shouting over each other, their voices rising in anger and frustration. Someone yelled that they needed their mail now, not in 6 weeks. Someone else pointed out that the cold snap would be over by then anyway. A man near the back demanded to know what legal authority the HOA had to prevent people from receiving federal mail delivery. Patricia banged a gavel on the table, trying to restore order. This is exactly the kind of chaos that happens when people ignore the rules. We have bylaws for a reason. If everyone just does whatever they want, property values will plummet and the neighborhood will fall into disarray. Property values. I found myself standing up, my voice cutting through the noise. Patricia, you're threatening to fine people for making sure they can receive their mail. How do you think that affects property values? How many potential buyers want to move into a neighborhood where the HOA prevents mail delivery? Patricia's face turned red. Mr. Jenkins, I should have known you'd be the ringleader of this rebellion. You've been in violation of HOA bylaws for over a month now, and you've refused to comply with repeated warnings. Because your warnings are ridiculous. I installed a $40 heater to keep my mailbox functional. It's not visible, it's not a safety hazard, and it's necessary for mail delivery. You're abusing your authority, and everyone in this room knows it. More voices joined in, supporting me. The room was getting heated, both figuratively and literally, with all the bodies packed into the small space. Patricia banged her gavel again. This meeting is adjourned. Anyone who has installed an unauthorized mailbox modification will be fined, and if those fines aren't paid, we will pursue all available legal remedies, including liens on your properties. She gathered her papers and stormed out, followed by her 2 board members. The rest of us stood there, looking at each other in stunned silence. Is she serious? Someone asked. Can she actually do that? She can try, I said, but I've talked to a lawyer. Her interpretation of the bylaws is questionable at best, and no judge is going to support placing liens over mailbox heaters. The problem is, fighting her costs money and time. An older gentleman I recognized from a few streets over spoke up. Maybe it's time we removed Patricia from the board. The bylaws allow for a vote of no confidence if 20% of homeowners sign a petition. That got people talking. We spent the next hour at the community center, discussing options and exchanging phone numbers. By the time I left, a core group of about 15 homeowners had committed to working together to challenge Patricia's authority. I drove home feeling slightly more optimistic, but that optimism was short-lived. The next morning, January 7th, I went out to check my mail and found my mailbox door hanging open again. The heater was still plugged in and working, but the mailbox itself had been pried open with some kind of tool. There were marks on the metal where something had been jammed into the seam between the door and the frame, bending it slightly so the door no longer closed properly. I immediately checked my security camera footage. The camera had a clear view of the mailbox, and the night vision had captured everything. At 3:17 that morning, a white BMW SUV had pulled up in front of my house. Patricia Reinhardt had gotten out, walked up to my mailbox with a crowbar, and spent about 2 minutes prying at the door until it bent open. Then she'd gotten back in her car and driven away. I had her on video, clear as day, committing vandalism on my property. I called Officer Thompson immediately. He came by within an hour, watched the footage, and shook his head. "Well, that makes my job easier," he said. "That's clear evidence of criminal damage to property. I'll need a copy of this footage and I'll get a warrant for her arrest." Just like that. Just like that. Vandalism is vandalism, Mr. Jenkins. Doesn't matter if it's HOA related or not. She came onto your property and deliberately damaged your mailbox. That's a crime. He took a copy of the footage and left. I spent the rest of the day trying to bend my mailbox door back into shape with limited success. The metal was warped and the door wouldn't latch properly anymore. That afternoon, I missed a delivery. Linda left a note saying she'd tried to deliver a package, but couldn't secure it in my mailbox because the door wouldn't close. She'd taken it back to the post office. Patricia's vandalism had now directly interfered with my mail delivery. The irony would have been funny if I wasn't so angry. 2 hours later, I watched from my window as a police car pulled up to Patricia's house, 3 doors down and across the street. Officer Thompson and another officer got out, walked to her door, and knocked. I couldn't hear what was said, but I could see Patricia's shocked expression when they showed her something, probably the arrest warrant. They didn't handcuff her, thankfully. That would have been too much drama even for this situation. But they did escort her to the police car and drive her away. The neighborhood group chat exploded. Within minutes, everyone knew Patricia had been arrested. The story got garbled in the retelling. Someone said she'd been caught stealing mail. Someone else thought she'd attacked me, but eventually, the truth came out. Patricia had vandalized my mailbox. I had video evidence, and she'd been arrested for criminal damage to property. The next few days were surreal. Patricia made bail quickly, but her arrest had become neighborhood gossip. People I'd never spoken to before were stopping me on the street to ask about it. The petition to remove her from the HOA board gained signatures rapidly. Within 3 days, we had the required 20% of homeowners and could call for a vote of no confidence. Meanwhile, the cold snap continued. More and more mailboxes were frozen solid. By January 10th, Linda told me she could only deliver to 5 houses in the entire subdivision. 2 of the mailbox heater owners had removed them after receiving Patricia's fines, not wanting the hassle, and their mailboxes had promptly frozen shut. The mail was piling up at the post office. Linda said they were storing held mail in bins, organized by address, but it was becoming a logistical nightmare. Some people were driving to the post office to pick up their mail in person, but the post office was overwhelmed with similar situations all over Duluth. The wait times were hours long. On January 12th, things took another turn. I received a call from Derek Martinez. "Scott, we have a problem," he said. "Well, Patricia has a problem, but it affects you too. The postal inspectors are getting involved." Postal inspectors? Why? Because mail delivery has been completely disrupted in your subdivision for over a week, and there's evidence that the HOA president has been deliberately sabotaging mailboxes. Interfering with mail delivery is a federal crime, Scott. This isn't just vandalism anymore. This is potentially mail tampering, which carries serious penalties. I sat down heavily on my couch. "You're telling me Patricia might face federal charges if the inspectors determine that her actions deliberately interfered with mail delivery?" "Yes." And given that she vandalized your mailbox, which then prevented your mail from being delivered, and given that she's been fining people for installing heaters that would allow mail delivery, I'd say there's a pretty strong case. This is insane. This is what happens when petty power goes unchecked. Patricia thought she could bully everyone into compliance with her interpretation of the rules, and she didn't think about the consequences. Now, she's facing criminal charges at both the state and potentially federal level. What do I need to do? Cooperate with the investigation if they contact you. Provide any documentation you have. And honestly, you might want to talk to the other homeowners. If multiple people have had their mail delivery disrupted because of HOA actions, that strengthens the federal case. I spent that evening making phone calls. I talked to Bill across the street, who hadn't received mail in 9 days and was missing prescription medication refills. I talked to the woman 2 houses down who was expecting important legal documents that hadn't arrived. I talked to a young couple at the end of the block who were trying to run a small online business and hadn't received any of their expected shipments. Everyone had the same story. Mail delivery had been disrupted because of frozen mailboxes, and when they'd tried to install heaters or other solutions, Patricia had threatened them with fines and violations. Several people had removed their heaters to avoid conflict, and their mail delivery had immediately stopped. The next morning, 2 federal postal inspectors showed up at my door. They wore badges and carried themselves with the kind of serious authority that made local police look casual. Inspector Chen and Inspector Rodriguez introduced themselves, showed their credentials, and asked if they could come in and ask me some questions. We sat at my kitchen table, and I walked them through everything. The initial mailbox heater installation, Patricia's complaints, the escalating fines and threats, the vandalism, the arrest, all of it. I showed them the security camera footage, the violation notices, the attorney letters, and the documentation I'd been keeping. Inspector Chen took notes while Inspector Rodriguez watched the security footage 3 times. "Mr. Jenkins," Inspector Chen said when I'd finished, "you mentioned that other residents have also been prevented from installing mailbox heaters. Do you have contact information for those individuals?" I did. I gave them the list of names and phone numbers I'd compiled the night before. "What's going to happen?" I asked. "We're conducting an investigation into whether federal mail tampering laws have been violated," Inspector Rodriguez said. "What we have here is a situation where mail delivery has been systematically disrupted to an entire subdivision. And there's evidence that the HOA president has taken deliberate actions to prevent residents from receiving mail. That's very concerning from our perspective. She vandalized my mailbox because she didn't want me to have a heater. She didn't steal my mail or anything. The law doesn't require theft. The law prohibits any willful obstruction of correspondence. If we determine that Miss Reinhardt's actions deliberately prevented or delayed mail delivery, that's a violation of federal law, regardless of her intent or motivation." They stayed for another hour, asking detailed questions and photographing everything. When they left, they told me they'd be in touch and that I should continue to document any issues with mail delivery. Over the next week, the postal inspectors interviewed multiple residents. The neighborhood was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Some people thought Patricia would go to federal prison. Others thought the whole thing was being blown out of proportion. A few die-hard Patricia supporters claimed she was being persecuted for trying to maintain neighborhood standards. Meanwhile, I'd replaced my mailbox entirely. The old one was too damaged to use, and I wasn't going to wait for Patricia to pay restitution. I bought a new heavy-duty mailbox with a reinforced locking mechanism. installed a new heater with the cord running through PVC conduit buried underground this time, and positioned my security camera for an even better view. The cold snap finally broke on January 20th. The temperature climbed all the way up to 15 degrees, which felt tropical after weeks of negative temperatures. Mailboxes started thawing out. Linda was able to resume normal delivery to most houses, but the damage was done. Residents had gone without mail for up to 2 weeks. Important documents had been delayed. Medications had been missed. Business shipments had been lost or returned to sender. The Lakeview Meadows subdivision had become known throughout the Duluth postal system as the HOA nightmare neighborhood. On January 23rd, the postal inspectors concluded their investigation. I received a call from Inspector Chen informing me that they were recommending federal charges against Patricia Reinhardt for obstruction of correspondence under Title 18, Section 1702 of the United States Code. "She'll be arrested again?" I asked. "She'll be charged. Whether she's arrested or simply receives a summons depends on the U.S. Attorney's Office. But Mr. Jenkins, I want to be clear about something. This case is significant not because of the specific actions Miss Reinhardt took, but because of the pattern of behavior and the impact on an entire community. We take mail delivery very seriously. It's a fundamental service, and when someone deliberately interferes with it for an extended period, affecting dozens of families, that's not something we overlook." "What kind of penalties are we talking about?" "For a first offense of obstruction of correspondence, the maximum penalty is 5 years in federal prison and substantial fines. Realistically, if she's convicted, she'll probably face probation, community service, and restitution to affected parties. But she'll have a federal record." 2 days later, Patricia was charged. A U.S. Marshal served her with a summons to appear in federal court. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The HOA vote of no confidence was scheduled for January 30th. Under normal circumstances, Patricia would have presided over the meeting as board president. Under these circumstances, with federal charges pending, she wisely chose to stay home. The meeting was held at the community center again, and this time the turnout was even larger. People were angry. They'd gone weeks without reliable mail delivery. They'd dealt with Patricia's harassment and threats, and now they'd learned that their HOA president was facing federal charges. The vote wasn't even close. 87% of homeowners voted to remove Patricia from the board immediately. The vote also removed the other 2 board members who'd supported her actions. We held an emergency election for new board members, and I found myself nominated. I tried to decline. I didn't want to be on the HOA board. I just wanted to live in my house, do my work, and receive my mail without drama. But people were insistent. They wanted board members who would use common sense, who understood that rules should serve the community, not the other way around. I ended up accepting, along with 4 other residents including Bill from across the street, and a retired teacher named Margaret who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. Our first act as the new HOA board was to review and revise the bylaws. We explicitly added language allowing functional modifications to mailboxes, including heating elements, as long as they didn't change the external appearance or create safety hazards. We also reduced the fine structure and created an appeals process so homeowners couldn't be bullied by a single board member. The second act was to drop all pending fines and violations related to mailbox heaters. Everyone who'd paid fines already would receive refunds. Anyone who'd been threatened with liens could rest easy. The third act was to send a formal letter to all residents apologizing for the disruption and explaining the new policies. Patricia's criminal cases moved slowly through the system. The state vandalism charge was relatively straightforward. She pleaded guilty in March, received probation, and was ordered to pay restitution for my damaged mailbox. She also had to complete community service and attend anger management classes. The federal charge was more complex. Her attorney tried to argue that she hadn't intended to interfere with mail delivery, that she was simply trying to enforce HOA rules. The prosecutors argued that intent didn't matter, that her actions had directly and foreseeably resulted in widespread mail delivery disruption. The case went to trial in May. I had to testify along with several other residents and Linda, our mail carrier. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Patricia was sentenced in June. The judge was surprisingly harsh, stating that, as an HOA president, Patricia had held a position of trust and authority in the community, and she'd abused that position to harass residents and disrupt essential services. She received 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, a $10,000 fine, and was ordered to pay restitution to all affected residents for documented losses related to delayed mail delivery. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Minnesota. By the time summer rolled around, life in Lakeview Meadows had returned to normal. The new HOA board operated smoothly and sensibly. Residents could install mailbox heaters without fear of retribution. Mail delivery was reliable. Patricia and her husband put their house on the market in July. I heard they were moving to Arizona. I saw her once loading boxes into a moving truck and we made eye contact briefly. She looked away first. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. Mostly, I just felt tired. The whole situation had been exhausting and unnecessary. If Patricia had just applied common sense instead of rigid rule enforcement, none of it would have happened. People would have installed mailbox heaters, received their mail, and life would have gone on. Instead, she'd created chaos, committed crimes, earned a federal conviction, and destroyed her own life over a $40 heating element. Linda stopped by one afternoon in August to deliver a package. I was out front watering my lawn and she pulled up with a smile. "Hey Scott, how's it going?" "Pretty good. Mail delivery's been smooth lately." "Yeah, ever since that whole thing got resolved, this route's been great. I can actually deliver to every house now. Several people have thanked me for testifying at that trial. You were just doing your job. So were you. You just wanted to get your mail. Crazy that it turned into such a big deal." She handed me the package. "You know what's funny? I've been delivering mail for 15 years and I've never seen anything like that. I've seen dogs, bad weather, broken mailboxes, but I've never seen someone deliberately try to prevent mail delivery for an entire neighborhood. Yeah, it was pretty unique. Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you fought back. Some people would have just given up and driven to the post office every day to pick up their mail. You actually fixed the problem." After she drove away, I stood there for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened. It had started with something so simple, such a small thing. A mailbox heater, $40 at the hardware store. A device designed to solve a common Minnesota winter problem, and it had ended with arrests, federal charges, trials, and a complete overhaul of the neighborhood HOA. I went inside, opened my package, which turned out to be a book I'd ordered, and settled onto my couch. Outside, the sun was shining. The temperature was a pleasant 75 degrees, and somewhere in Arizona, Patricia was probably unpacking boxes in her new house. hopefully learning that sometimes rules need to serve people, not the other way around. The mailbox heater sat in my mailbox, its little LED light off, because it only activated when the temperature dropped below freezing. It would sit dormant through the summer and fall, but come winter, when the temperature plummeted and the snow started flying, it would warm up again, keeping my mailbox functional and ensuring that I could receive my mail without any drama, just like it should have been all along. The story could have ended there, but there was one more development I should mention. In September, I received a letter from the U.S. Postal Service. It was an official commendation, thanking me for my cooperation during the investigation and for taking action to ensure reliable mail delivery in my neighborhood. Apparently, the case had become a training example for postal inspectors, illustrating how HOA disputes could escalate into federal crimes and the importance of protecting mail delivery infrastructure. The letter was signed by some regional director whose name I didn't recognize, and it came with a certificate suitable for framing. I stuck it in a drawer and forgot about it. But Bill from across the street saw it when he came over for a barbecue in October, and he insisted on telling everyone about it. Within a week, the whole neighborhood knew, and I became that guy who got a commendation from the post office for fighting the HOA. It was embarrassing, honestly. I hadn't done anything heroic. I just wanted to receive my mail. Everything else had been Patricia's doing. The new HOA board continued to function well. We met once a month, reviewed requests and concerns, and generally tried to be reasonable human beings about everything. There were still occasional disputes, mostly about noise complaints or tree branches hanging over property lines, but nothing that couldn't be resolved with a couple of phone calls and basic courtesy. In November, as the weather started turning cold again, I noticed several new mailbox heaters appearing throughout the neighborhood. People were being proactive this time, installing them before the first hard freeze. I saw Bill installing one, and when I walked over to say hello, he grinned. "Learned my lesson last year," he said. "Not going through that again. Got this one on sale too. $25. Good deal." Yep. And I filled out Form HOA 7B just to be official, even though the new bylaws say I don't really need approval for something like this. We'll rubber stamp it at the next meeting. I know. That's the point. The system works now. We have rules, but they make sense, and the people enforcing them aren't power-hungry control freaks. He was right. That was really what the whole situation had been about. Not mailbox heaters or frozen locks or even mail delivery. It had been about power and control and someone who'd let a small amount of authority go to her head. The first hard freeze came in late November, right around Thanksgiving. The temperature dropped to -5, and I watched as my mailbox heater's LED light clicked on automatically. The next morning, Linda delivered my mail without any issues. So did everyone else's mail throughout the neighborhood. No frozen mailboxes, no missed deliveries, no drama. Just the way it should be. I spent Thanksgiving with some neighbors, a potluck dinner at Bill's house with about 15 people from the street. We ate too much turkey, drank too much wine, and at some point, someone inevitably brought up the Patricia situation. "Remember last year?" Margaret said, laughing. "We were all freaking out about not getting our mail, and Patricia was threatening to put liens on everyone's property." "Don't remind me," someone else groaned. "I went 2 weeks without mail, missed my nephew's birthday because I couldn't send a card. And now look at us. Mail every day, no problems, and an HOA board that actually makes sense." Bill raised his glass. To Scott for having the balls to stand up to Patricia. I waved that off. I just didn't want to pay a ridiculous fine. "You did more than that," Margaret said. You showed everyone that the HOA isn't some untouchable authority. It's supposed to serve us, not the other way around. Patricia forgot that, or maybe she never knew it. We moved on to other topics after that, but the conversation stuck with me. Had I really made that much of a difference? I didn't feel like I'd done anything special. I just refused to be bullied, documented everything, and let the system work. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what people needed to see. That standing up to petty tyranny was possible, that rules could be challenged when they didn't make sense, and that sometimes doing the right thing meant being willing to fight. Winter progressed, and the neighborhood settled into a comfortable routine. Mail was delivered. Snow was plowed. Life went on. The Lakeview Meadows subdivision became just another quiet neighborhood in Duluth, Minnesota, instead of the cautionary tale it had been for a few months. I kept working from home, doing my software development, shoveling my driveway, and living my life. The mailbox heater hummed along quietly whenever the temperature dropped, doing its job without fanfare or drama. Sometimes I'd walk out to get my mail and see the little LED light glowing inside the mailbox, and I'd think about everything that had happened. How something so small had become so big. How one person's inflexibility had created so much chaos. How a community had come together to fix a problem that never should have existed in the first place. And I'd grab my mail, usually some bills and junk mail and maybe a package, and go back inside my warm house, grateful that the most complicated part of my day was deciding what to have for dinner. By December, the previous year's drama felt like ancient history. New families had moved into the neighborhood, including a young couple who bought Patricia's old house. They were nice people, a teacher and a nurse, and they had no idea about the mailbox wars that had taken place. When they asked me about the neighborhood at a Christmas party, I just said it was a quiet place with a reasonable HOA and reliable mail delivery. They didn't need to know the rest. They didn't need to know about Patricia or the threats or the federal charges or any of it. They just needed to know that they could live here peacefully, install a mailbox heater if they wanted one, and receive their mail without anyone hassling them about it. That was enough. The case did have one lasting impact beyond our neighborhood. The Minnesota State Legislature took note of what had happened, and in the spring session, they passed a new law explicitly protecting homeowners' rights to install functional modifications for essential services, including mail delivery, regardless of HOA rules. The law was nicknamed the Mailbox Heater Bill by the media, which was both amusing and slightly embarrassing for everyone involved. I got a call from a state representative asking if I'd come testify in support of the bill. I declined, suggesting they talk to Linda or one of the postal inspectors instead. I'd had enough of being in the spotlight. I just wanted to live my life. The bill passed unanimously, which tells you something about how obviously reasonable it was. Even the most pro-HOA legislators couldn't justify giving HOAs the power to interfere with mail delivery. Derek Martinez called me when the bill was signed into law. "You know, you basically changed state law, right? That's your legacy." My legacy is that I wanted to get my mail without my mailbox freezing shut. Sure, but the result is that thousands of Minnesota homeowners now have explicit legal protection against overreaching HOAs. That's not nothing. He was probably right, but it still felt weird to think about it that way. I hadn't set out to change anything. I just refused to back down when confronted with something unreasonable. The 1-year anniversary of the whole mess came and went without fanfare. January rolled around again, bringing with it the usual Minnesota cold. My mailbox heater worked perfectly. Mail was delivered every day. The HOA board continued to function well, Patricia never contacted me. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she and her husband had settled into their new life in Arizona, where HOAs are even more powerful and prevalent than in Minnesota, which seemed ironic. I wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience, or if she was already picking fights with her new neighbors over Christmas decorations or lawn ornaments. I hoped she'd learned something. I hoped she'd realized that power, even small-scale neighborhood power, comes with responsibility. That rules should serve the community, not personal preferences. That sometimes flexibility and common sense matter more than rigid enforcement. But I doubted it. People like Patricia rarely changed. They just found new battles to fight, new hills to die on, new rules to enforce. As for me, I kept living my quiet life in Duluth. I continued working from home, continued serving on the HOA board with Bill and Margaret and the others, continued getting my mail delivered every day without drama. The mailbox heater I'd installed that first November was still working perfectly 2 years later. $40 well spent. Maybe the best $40 I'd ever spent, considering everything that had come from it. Not because I'd wanted to start a fight or change laws or become a neighborhood hero, but because I'd wanted something simple and reasonable, to receive my mail during Minnesota winter without having to drive to the post office. That's what the whole thing had really been about in the end. Not HOA politics or federal crimes or community standards. Just the basic expectation that you should be able to get your mail delivered to your house, even when it's negative 20 degrees outside and everything's frozen solid. Such a simple thing. Such a reasonable expectation. And yet, it had taken arrests, trials, federal charges, and a change in state law to make it happen. I thought about that sometimes, usually when I was standing at my mailbox in the cold, grabbing my letters and packages. How something so obvious and necessary had been treated as a violation, a crime, something worthy of fines and threats and harassment. It said something about HOAs, about petty power, about what happens when people forget that they're supposed to be serving a community, not ruling over it. But it also said something about persistence, about standing up for what's right even when it's inconvenient, about refusing to be bullied just because someone has a title and some printed bylaws. Linda pulled up one afternoon in February, during a particularly cold spell, and handed me a package. She was bundled up in layers, her breath fogging in the air. "Your heater still working good?" she asked, like a charm. "Yours?" She'd finally gotten the post office to install heated collection boxes along several routes. "Oh yeah, makes such a difference." I'm actually ahead of schedule today because I'm not fighting frozen mailboxes. That's great. Yeah. You know, in a weird way, that whole mess with your HOA president ended up making my job better. The post office started taking the frozen mailbox problem more seriously after the federal case. We've got better equipment now, better procedures. So thanks, I guess. You're welcome, I guess. We both laughed. She drove off to finish her route, and I went back inside with my package, which turned out to be a birthday present from my sister in Seattle. Life went on. Seasons changed. The HOA board dealt with normal neighborhood issues like covenant updates and landscaping contracts and snow removal bids. Everything was boring and routine and exactly how it should be. The security camera I'd installed to catch the mailbox vandal was still mounted on my porch, still recording, though nothing interesting had happened in its view for over a year. Just mail delivery, neighbors walking dogs, the occasional package delivery. Normal life. I thought about taking it down, but decided to leave it up. Not because I expected more trouble, but because it was a reminder. A reminder that documentation matters, that evidence matters, that sometimes you need proof to back up your reasonable position against unreasonable people. And maybe, in some small way, it was a reminder that you could fight City Hall, or in this case, fight the HOA and win. Not by being aggressive or confrontational, but by being right, being persistent, and being willing to let the system work. The mailbox heater hummed quietly inside my mailbox, doing its job, keeping things warm enough to function even in the coldest Minnesota winter. Such a simple device. Such a simple solution to a simple problem. If only Patricia had understood that simplicity, everything would have been different. She'd still be living in the neighborhood, still be HOA president if she wanted to be, still have a clean record instead of a federal conviction. But she'd chosen rigidity over flexibility, power over service, enforcement over common sense. And in the end, that choice had cost her everything. I grabbed my mail, headed back inside, and got back to work. Outside, the wind howled, the temperature hovered around -10, and the mailbox heater kept things warm and functional, exactly as intended. Just another winter day in Minnesota, in a quiet neighborhood where people could now heat their mailboxes without fear of fines or harassment or federal intervention. Progress, I suppose. Hard-won, unnecessarily complicated progress, but progress nonetheless. And sometimes, that's the best you can hope for.